Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar covering the components of the quantitative methodology chapter. And just before we get into the presentation, I'd like to provide some contact information in case you are interested in additional help outside of this webinar. So we do provide full service assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in help outside of this webinar and more one-on-one assistance, you can use this information to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. So first, I'm just going to start with an overview of what we're going to be covering in this presentation. So I'll start off by briefly talking about the purpose of the methodology chapter, and then really the bulk of the presentation is going to be about the different components of the methodology chapter. So what are the different sections of the chapter and what needs to be included in each section? So we'll go over the different sections that are most commonly included in the methodology chapter, and then at the end, we will have time for a question and answer session where you can ask specific questions. And so we will save all the questions for the end of the presentation. If you do have a question, you're welcome to type that into the question box at any time. And if the question isn't already answered through the course of the presentation, we will answer it once the presentation is completed. Okay, so first let's talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter. So why is the methodology chapter important? The first couple of chapters of your dissertation, namely the introduction and the literature review, are geared towards why you're conducting your study, but the methodology is geared towards how you're conducting your study. So the methodology chapter describes how you will be conducting your research. And so therefore, the methodology section should be detailed enough so that your research can be replicated by others. You really want to approach the methodology like it is a manual or a set of instructions that you are giving to other researchers that they could follow so that they would be able to conduct your study in the exact same way if they wanted to. And it's important to note that although there are many sections that are going to be commonly included or required in most methodologies or methodology chapters, it's important to double check with your school's guidelines to determine the specific requirements that your program or your school has. We'll be covering, really the kind of the foundational sections, the sections that are most commonly included in the methodology, but your school may have specific requirements. They, may require additional sections, or there might be parts that they don't require or they require more information on. So you always want to defer to your school's requirements in terms of what exact information needs to be in the methodology chapter. Okay, so now let's get into the different components of the chapter, starting with the introduction. So the introduction is pretty simple. You usually just want to start off by restating the purpose of the study or the problem statement, and there might be specific subsections for this. And depending on your school may want you to just provide an abbreviated version of the problem or purpose statements, or they might want you to just restate your problem and purpose verbatim from your previous chapters. And then you'll also want to state your research questions and hypotheses. And everywhere throughout your dissertation document, the research questions and hypotheses should always be stated the exact same way. So those should always be stated verbatim throughout your document. They should never change. So you want to make sure that when you are restating your problem and purpose, and especially when you're restating your research questions and hypotheses, that those align with how you have presented them in your previous chapters. And then after you state those things, it's common to just provide a preview or an outline of the sections that will be included in the chapter. And this can really just be as simple as listing off the different section headings that you're going to be covering in the chapter, just to orient the reader to what contents the chapter will have. So next, you usually present information about the research design. Some schools may also require you to have a similar section about the research methodology. And the difference is, for the research methodology, you would be justifying your choice of a quantitative study as opposed to a qualitative or a mixed method study, whereas the research design is talking about specifically your choice of the specific quantitative design. So something like correlational, experimental, quasi-experimental, or causal comparative, and why you chose that specific design. So again, some schools may require you to just talk about the research design if it's implied that you're in a type of program where you only do quantitative studies, but sometimes you'll also need to justify selecting a quantitative research method. In any case, the structure of these sections is pretty much the same. So you want to state the specific design that you've selected. So for instance, correlational, and then explain why you selected that design. And this should be aligned to the problem, purpose, and research questions of your study. So you want to make sure that you state your rationale so that it aligns with your problem and purpose. For instance, if you pick a correlational design, maybe that's because your research questions and the purpose of your study deal with looking at relationships between variables. And then in addition to justifying why you picked your specific design, you also want to talk about other types of quantitative designs and why you did not select those. So it's fine to talk about, if you're doing a correlational study, why you did correlational, but you also may need to justify why you didn't do an experimental study or a causal comparative study. And so similar to the reasons why you selected your design, you want to talk about the reasons why you didn't select other types of designs in relation to your problem, purpose, and research questions. And the selection of other types, or the selection of your design over other types of designs may also have to do with practical limitations. So for instance, maybe it's not possible for you to do an experimental study due to the nature of the variables that you're looking at. And again, if you have to do a section on the general methodology, you would follow this same format. So you'd explain why you chose a quantitative design, how that aligns with your problem, purpose, and research questions, and why a qualitative or a mixed method design was not appropriate for your study. So now let's talk about the population and sample. And this is a good information because a lot of students get confused at this part about what the difference between the population and the sample is. So the population is the broad group of individuals or people that your results are intended to generalize to. So in other words, it's the larger group of people that your study is about. So for instance, maybe you're doing a study on nurses. So perhaps your population would just be all registered nurses in the United States. Whereas your sample would just be the subset of those registered nurses that actually end up participating in your study. And so you want to state that population of interest. And again, the population is just the general broad group of people that your study is about. And then you want to, if possible, describe the characteristics of that population and provide an estimate of the population size. And you want to provide citations to support this information. It may or may not be possible for you to find out the exact size or exact characteristics of the population that you're interested in. So you really just want to describe the population as best as you can if it's not possible for you to get exact numbers. And also estimates are usually adequate in terms of getting an idea of how many individuals are in your population of interest. So for instance, if you're doing that study on nurses, you would want to get some sort of estimate, from maybe something like, Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you're looking at a specific type of nurse, like how many registered nurses are employed in the United States. You get some kind of estimate on that. And so whereas the population is the larger group of people that your study is about, your sample is the specific group of people from that larger population that will be participating in your study. And so you want to describe in the sample section exactly how you are going to pick individuals from the larger population to participate in your study. So you'll want to describe the sampling strategy or techniques. So this could be some kind of random sampling technique, but more likely you'll be using something like a convenience sampling technique, because in random sampling, it means that every individual in the population would have an equal chance of being able to participate in your study. Whereas in convenience sampling, you are selecting participants based on what is available to you and what is convenient for you to access. So most studies will probably be using some type of non-probability or convenience sampling, and you need to discuss how exactly you are going to identify those individuals. So how are you going to find a group of registered nurses to participate in your study? So you want to describe how the sample will be selected from the population and recruited into your study. And if you're doing the registered nurses study, how are you going to identify those people? Is there a list of registered nurses with contact information? Are you able to contact them that way? If you're doing something like an online survey where you have to email your survey to participants or distribute your survey to participants online, how are you going to identify potential individuals to distribute the survey to? Will you have a list of email addresses for people who may be qualified to participate in your study? And if so, how are you going to get that list of emails? You want to be very specific about how you are going to be identifying the individuals and how you're going to be contacting them to invite them into your study. If it's more of an in-person study rather than online, you want to describe things like how are you going to distribute information about your study or invitations for your study? Like, are you going to be posting notices or flyers somewhere where people will be able to see them and get information about your study? Then also in the sample section, you want to discuss your sample size. So how many participants will you need for your study? And so you want to calculate the required sample size for your analysis and state your target sample size. And generally, you would use a power analysis to do this. And I won't be getting into details of power analysis in this presentation. We do have other webinars that cover power analysis, but for quantitative studies, power analysis is typically the method required for calculating the sample size for your study. So now that we've covered the population and the sample, now we'll talk about the instrumentation. And so in the instrumentation section, you want to state what kinds of materials or instruments you're using to measure each variable of interest in your study. So if you're doing something like a survey study where you have different survey instruments that measure different variables of interest, in this section, you want to describe each of those instruments. And you want to be very detailed about the information that you present for each instrument. And you want to make sure that there is an instrument presented for each variable in your study. So in terms of describing the instrument, for instance, if it is a survey instrument, you will want to say, how many items or questions the survey has. You'll want to talk about the response scale. So how do participants respond to the items? Do they use like a Likert scale, like a 5-point Likert scale or a 7-point Likert scale? Or do they use some other method of responding? And you'll also want to talk about how the instrument is scored. So if it's, a 10-item instrument measuring something like anxiety, then you want to be able to say, how you're going to take those 10 items and get an anxiety score from that. And once you've presented information about each of the instruments, so the items of the instrument, how they're scored, and all the details of those, you also want to present evidence for the validity and the reliability for each instrument. And depending on your school, you may need to include this information in the instrumentation section itself, or your school template might have completely separate sections that cover validity and reliability. So that's another issue where you'll want to double check your school's guidelines and see if you have specific sections dedicated to validity and reliability. But if not, then this information usually goes in the instrumentation section. And so for validity, you want to present statistical evidence that the instrument is valid. And usually this comes from something like a factor analysis. And typically this information is found in the research article that talks about the original development of the instrument. So if you go back to the original article that talks about the creation of the instrument and how the instrument was developed, usually the statistical tests for validity and reliability as well are located in those articles. And for validity, you would usually be talking about the results of something like a factor analysis. And then you do the same thing for reliability. And typically for reliability, you're talking about something like Cronbach's alpha. So you'd be reporting Cronbach's alpha reliability coefficients or split half correlations or some kind of other measure for reliability. Okay. So now let's talk about data collection procedures. And this is really one of the most important, if not the most important section of your methodology, because this describes exactly how you are going to be conducting your study. So thinking back to before when we talked about your methodology needs to be like a set of instructions, this is basically where you present the step-by-step instructions for how the study should be conducted. You'll want to describe in a step-by-step fashion how you're going to be collecting the data. And again, this should be detailed enough so that what you do can be repeated by other researchers. Another researcher should be able to read your methodology and your data collection procedures and be able to conduct the study in the exact same way. So you want to start basically from when you get IRB approval to when participants exit the study and you've collected your data and you're ready to analyze it. You want to describe all of the steps in between. So thinking to once you get approval from IRB to conduct your study, what's the first thing you're going to do? Then what are you going to do after that? And you should describe all the steps in that process. But typically, you'll want to include in these steps where and how the data collection will take place. So this is true for both in-person and online studies. If it's an in-person study, where exactly are participants going to be participating in the study, and what are they going to be doing? If it's online, then you'll want to describe the platform for conducting the online study and how exactly you're going to be administering your instruments online. And you'll want to talk about how participants are going to provide consent. So in person, usually participants would sign an actual physical copy of a consent form, whereas online, they might read consent information and then endorse some item to say that they understand the study and are willing to participate. And again, you want to talk about how and when each instrument is going to be administered in your study. So if you have multiple instruments, for example, what order will they be presented in? And how are they going to be administered? And if you're doing something like a longitudinal study or a pre-test, post-test study where participants are going to be measured at multiple points in time, this is important when talking about when the different parts of your study are going to take place. So how much time will there be in between the pre-test and the post-test? When are participants going to take each measure? And how are you going to be sure to link the participants' responses together if you're doing a pre-test and a post-test study? So you want to include all of those details in your data collection procedures. And so your data collection procedures, like I mentioned before, should cover everything that's going to happen between IRB approval and when you have collected all the data and you're ready to analyze the data. Once you get to that point, then you're ready to start describing your data analysis plan. So in the data analysis plan, you want to start off with describing how the data are going to be compiled or entered into an electronic format. And this applies mainly if you're doing an in-person study using something like paper and pencil or physical copies of questionnaires. You will need to describe the process of entering the data into an electronic format that you'll be able to use to run the statistical analyses. If you are collecting your data online, then your data are probably automatically going to be saved in an electronic format. So that process will not be as involved. And you can usually just directly download a spreadsheet containing your data from whatever survey hosting service you're using. You'll want to state the software that you're going to be using for both the data cleaning and the analysis. So if you're using something like SPSS or a different software, or maybe you're doing some data cleaning in Excel before you put the data into SPSS, you want to say exactly what software you're going to be using. Then you want to describe how you're going to clean and prepare the data for analysis. And typically this involves checking the data for accuracy and dealing with missing data. So the checking the data for accuracy mainly applies when, again, if you're doing an in-person study and you had to enter the data manually into an electronic format, you'll want to double check the data to make sure everything was entered correctly and that there are no mistakes in the data entry. So that would be checking the data for accuracy. And then you'll also want to check for missing responses, because especially if you're doing any kind of survey study, you can do the best you can to make sure that participants complete all the questions, but usually you're going to have at least some missing data, and you will need a plan for how you're going to deal with missing data. So you'll want to talk about if you're just going to remove any participant that is missing any data, or if you're going to try to keep participants that are missing some responses, how are you going to deal with the missing responses? Are you going to try to replace them somehow using a mean replacement or an imputation? Or are you going to deal with the missing data in some other way? You'll want a specific plan for how you're going to deal with missing responses. And then once you talk about the data cleaning, you'll want to talk about the specific analyses that you're going to conduct. So talk about first descriptive statistics. Generally, you'll just include descriptives on all of your variables and the participants' demographic information. And then you'll want to describe the analysis that you're going to use to answer each research question and hypothesis. And so the data analysis plan section can be structured according to the research questions and the hypotheses. So you can just list out each research question and then state what analysis you are going to use to answer that research question. So you want to state the details of the analysis, so what type of analysis you're doing, why it's appropriate to do that analysis, and what variables are going to be used in that analysis. So what are your independent variables, your dependent variables, and any control or covariate variables you're going to be using in each analysis. And you'll also want to describe the level of statistical significance that you're going to be using for each analysis. So typically this is set to 0.05, and also discuss any measures of effect size that you're going to use for each analysis. And for each analysis that you do, you want to describe the assumptions of the analysis. So if you're doing any kind of parametric statistical analyses, there will be assumptions that need to be tested for those analyses. So you'll want to describe the assumptions that are required for each analysis, how you're going to test each of those assumptions, and also, if you can, include plans for if assumptions are violated, what do you plan to do? So if your test requires the data to be normally distributed and you find that the data are not normally distributed, how are you going to deal with that problem? Are you going to do some kind of transformation on the data to make it normally distributed? Or are you going to use an alternative test that doesn't require the data to be normally distributed? So for instance, a non-parametric test. So all of those details you will want included in your data analysis plan. Next, let's talk about limitations. This is one of those sections that some schools may require it, some schools may not, because sometimes you discuss limitations in earlier chapters, but usually if there's a limitations section required for the methodology, it's specifically about limitations of the research design. So whatever research design you choose, there are going to be limitations associated with that design. And you'll want to talk about what those limitations are and what things you'll be doing to mitigate limitations if possible. So for instance, for correlational studies, the main limitation of a correlational study is that you can't determine cause and effect relationships between variables. You can basically just say that two variables are correlated or related to each other, but you can't state that one variable causes another in a correlational study. In survey studies, you may have to deal with limitations associated with different types of response biases, such as social desirability bias. And in this case, you want to talk about the potential for response biases and what you'll be doing to try to mitigate response bias. So for instance, to mitigate something like social desirability bias, you might say that you're going to make sure that you're going to ensure participants that the survey responses are going to be anonymous or confidential, so that you'll increase the likelihood that they're going to give you honest responses. And then for designs involving things like pre-test and post-test, there are limitations and issues relating to things like attrition, testing effects, history, and maturation. And then in experimental studies, limitations around those usually involve external validity. So how well can the results of your experiment be generalized to actual real world conditions? All right. And finally, let's talk about ethical considerations. This is usually one of the last, if not the last section that goes in the methodology chapter. So you want to talk about the different ethical issues that are relevant to your study. And many schools will require you to specifically note and talk about the principles of the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report relates to different principles that are required to conduct ethical research with human participants. And the principles that are usually required to discuss in relation to the Belmont Report are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. So sometimes your school may require you to list each of those principles and talk about specifically how you're going to ensure each of those principles are met. You'll also want to talk about IRB approval. Most likely you will need institutional approval from an IRB in order to conduct your research. So you will want to talk about the fact that you will have to get IRB approval and you will receive IRB approval before you can collect any data from participants. You'll want to talk about your informed consent process. So talk about how participants are going to provide informed consent and what types of information are going to be provided on the consent form. You'll also want to talk about the risks involved in your study, and specifically whether your study involves minimal risk or more than minimal risk. A lot of students will make the mistake of saying that their study involves no risk, but that really isn't true, because any research study, even if it's just an anonymous online survey, does involve some risks, even if they are incredibly minimal. So you should never really state that there are no risks in your research, but you may be able to state that the risks in your research are minimal and are no greater than what participants may experience in normal everyday life. But regardless of whether the risks are minimal or more than minimal, you do want to acknowledge those risks and have a plan for how you are going to mitigate those risks. And that discussion becomes more involved if your study involves more than minimal risk. So if you're doing some kind of experiment or a medical study, something that involves, actual physical or psychological risk to participants, then you'll want to provide details about how those types of risks are going to be mitigated. And you'll want to talk about how participants' identities and information is going to be protected. So if you're doing an online survey, are participants' responses going to be completely anonymous, or do you have to collect some kind of identifier from participants? And if so, you'll need to talk about how you're going to keep participants' identities protected and confidential. And you also want to talk about how you are going to store the data and how you're going to destroy the data after the study is over. So if you're doing an in-person study, so collecting like paper and pencil questionnaires, where are you going to store the completed questionnaires? If it's an online study, how are the data going to be electronically stored? They're going to be stored on a cloud server that is encrypted, or if it's going to be stored on a hard drive on a password protected computer. And then you want to talk about how the data is going to be destroyed. And typically schools will have guidelines for how long you're required to retain the data after the study is over. And then after that period, you will want to destroy the data, and you'll want to discuss that process. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the presentation on the components of the chapter. And so again, here's just some contact information in case you are interested in additional support beyond these webinars. And with that, I'll go ahead and get into the questions to see if there are any specific questions. Okay, so the first question that I have is, I'm doing a quasi-experimental design. Will you discuss the design? So for quasi-experimental designs, it's similar to an experimental design where you are essentially comparing participants under different conditions or different groups of participants. But in a quasi-experimental design, the conditions or groups are not randomly assigned to the participants. The groups are either pre-existing, or the nature of the study is such that you are not able to randomly assign participants to the groups that you are comparing. So anytime you're doing any kind of study where you are comparing participants across groups or conditions, and the participants cannot be randomly assigned to those conditions, that would make it a quasi-experimental study. And so really the difference between quasi-experimental and experimental is that the causal conclusions that you can draw from quasi-experimental studies are limited compared to those that you can draw from true experiments where you can randomly assign participants to conditions. So the next question is, can you talk about how to determine effect size for the power analysis with a very small size? So in terms of the power analysis, if you're in the stage of writing the methodology, you are typically calculating how many participants you will need for the analysis. So you would set some kind of effect size. So say for instance, if a small, medium, or large effect size, and that with the type of analysis that you're doing, so if it's a regression or an ANOVA or a t-test, you determine how many participants you would need for that analysis. However, sometimes you're in a situation where you may be working with pre-existing data, or for some reason you may already know how many participants you will have or will be able to get. And in that case, you could do what's called a post hoc power analysis, where you calculate the power that you will get from that sample size, depending on the type of analysis that you're doing and the type of effect size that you are expecting. But in terms of the effect size, generally, if you are working with a smaller sample size, then you'll need a larger effect size to get statistical significance with that smaller sample size. The smaller your sample, the larger the size of the effect needs to be in order to find statistical significance. But that doesn't mean that you should set the effect size based on how many participants you know or expect that you will have. The effect size really needs to be determined based on the literature, or if there are no suggestions in the literature as to what effect size you may expect to find in your study, then usually you would go with the default of a medium effect size. Okay, and so the next question. I have a question here that is, how many sample items above my target sample size should I select? This is a really good question because G-Power, or if you do a power analysis in a program like G-Power, it will tell you the minimum sample size you need in order to do a particular analysis. However, you may try to collect that many people, but you may have some attrition in your sample. So if your power analysis tells you you need 100 people, you collect surveys from 100 people, but maybe a couple of those people you need to drop because they didn't complete the whole survey, or they had other problems with their data that make it unusable. So even if you collect the 100 people, your final sample size may not be 100. So that gets into the issue of, should you, and if so, how much should you oversample beyond the sample size that the power analysis calculates for you? And there's no real rule for exactly how much you should oversample, but some schools will recommend something like 15 to 20% in terms of oversampling. So if, for instance, your sample size calculation tells you you need 100 participants, then you might want to sample 115 people or 120 people to account for the fact that some of those people may have to be dropped from the analysis. So that's just kind of a general guideline, that 15 to 20% oversampling. And some schools will actually specifically tell you how much you need to oversample. But in those cases, they usually suggest something like 15 to 20%. And next question is, how do you examine validity and reliability? So going back to the issues of validity and reliability in the methodology, typically you would be presenting evidence of the validity and reliability for the instruments that have already been established in the literature. So you would be looking into the research that's already been done and presenting the evidence from that research that your instruments are valid and reliable. In the case where you need to establish your own validity and reliability, that's usually only if you are creating your own instrument. Typically, if you're using an instrument that's already been validated, you won't have to do your own tests of validity and reliability, which is why in the methodology section, you're usually reporting on evidence from previous studies on validity and reliability. But in terms of tests for validity and reliability, as I mentioned before, for validity, you're usually looking at results of a factor analysis. So whether it's an exploratory or a confirmatory factor analysis, and reliability is usually assessed using a Cronbach's alpha coefficient or some other coefficient like a split half correlation, or you could do something like test retest reliability. Okay, see the next question here. Okay, so I've run a pilot study to explore the view of university staff. Is it okay to accept this as qualitative data in my study, or do I have to do a new sample? So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking here, but I think maybe what you're asking is, if you collect a pilot study, do you have to do a new sample of participants on top of the pilot study when you do kind of your full study? And the answer to that would be yes. So if you're doing some kind of pilot study for an instrument, or even if it's a pilot to set up your main study. For instance, if you're doing some kind of instrument development, you might do a pilot study as part of that instrument development and validation. But you would need to collect a separate new sample, and typically a larger sample of participants to be in your main study for qualitative research or quantitative research. Okay, so the next question is, do ethical considerations need to be included if you're using secondary data? What are some differences and what should or is not necessary to be included for secondary data? So this is a really good question. And the answer is yes, you should still have an ethical considerations section, even if you're using secondary data. But as you allude to, the discussion of this will be a little bit different compared to if you're collecting primary data. So for secondary data, you want to typically discuss, again, how you're going to make sure that the data that you're using is protected and kept confidential, especially if the secondary data that you're using contains any personal identifiers of the participants. So even if you didn't collect that data yourself, if it has any personally identifying information in it, you have to be especially careful with how you handle that data. And so you still want to discuss procedures for how you're going to keep the data secure. And sometimes reviewers will also want you to discuss the original ethical procedures of the study where the data were actually collected. So the original study that collected the data in the first place, what procedures did they use to ensure that their participants were protected? So that can be part of your discussion as well. So if you're using secondary data, it won't be, the ethical considerations won't be as involved as if you're collecting the data yourself, but there are still some points that you should discuss, mainly how you're going to be treating that data and how you're going to make sure that that data stays secure and is used in a proper and ethical way. Okay, let's see some other questions here. So a question here is, if I'm having SurveyMonkey conduct my data collection with their database pool of participants, can you explain the sampling method and how that changes the write-up of data collection procedures? So you definitely can use something like SurveyMonkey's data collection pool, and a lot of people will state that, if they use something like this, that they're using random sampling, but that's not really necessarily true, because when you use something like SurveyMonkey to help with your recruitment and data collection, you are, as you said, using their database of people. So the only people that could end up participating in your study would be the people who are signed up to take surveys with SurveyMonkey. And that may not necessarily be reflective of the entire population of interest that you are looking at. So in essence, using something like SurveyMonkey means you are doing a form of non-probability or convenience sampling, because you're just looking at the subset of the population of people who are signed up to take surveys with SurveyMonkey. And so that is how that impacts the sampling method. And then in terms of the data collection procedures, it's really, you just want to provide as much detail as you can about your process of working with SurveyMonkey to collect data from participants. So you want to describe, how you're going to set up your survey with SurveyMonkey, the details of your inclusion and exclusion criteria, of how they're going to help select participants, and how they're going to contact those participants in their data collection pool and invite them into the study. So you really just want to provide as much detail as you can about that process. Okay, so next question is, designing a series of experiments, and I used an online power analysis calculator to calculate my sample size. However, the sample size seems quite high. So when I look at the sample sizes of experimental studies, they are much lower. What would you advise? So there are, different methods that people may use for determining or calculating sample size. Usually for a quantitative dissertation study, again, a power analysis using something like G-power is going to be the most accepted method. Another method is looking at previous studies that have used similar designs or analyses to determine what previous studies have used as a sample size and use that as a guide. But more often than not, your school is going to require an actual power analysis calculation. And that's going to be based on the specific analysis that you are conducting, not necessarily the design of the experiment. So it's possible that, maybe other studies, they may have used a similar type of design, but maybe they did a different type of analysis or had a different number of variables, and that can affect the power calculation. So you have to keep in mind that the power calculation is going to be dependent on the type of analysis that you're doing, and not necessarily just the research design itself. Next question is, what's the difference between I think a priori and post power analysis? So that's a priori and post hoc power analysis. So a priori would mean that you are calculating how many participants you need given the type of analysis that you want to do and the effect size that you expect to see. And the post hoc would be calculating the statistical power that you can achieve given the type of analysis that you want to do and the number of participants that you have. So a priori is used to determine the sample size that you need. Post hoc is used to determine the level of power that you can get given a certain sample size. And that's usually done if you do your study and you don't collect enough participants. They may want to see a post hoc power analysis to determine what the power of your study was if you had a low number of participants. And another question is, what is the cutoff points for small, medium, and large effect size? And that is going to be dependent on the type of analysis that you're doing, because different analyses will have different measures of effect size. So for instance, a t-test would use something like Cohen's d for effect size, and a correlation coefficient or a Pearson correlation, the effect size would just be the correlation coefficient itself. So for each type of analysis, the actual measure of effect size is going to be different, and so the cutoffs for those effect sizes are going to be different as well. And usually you can look in the statistics literature, specifically Cohen is what a lot of people cite in terms of cutoffs for small, medium, and large effect sizes for different types of analyses. Okay, let me see if I can just get to a couple more questions here. All right, so the question is, I conduct a pilot study, and then after you analyze the data, what's the best way to carry out the study? Build scale or bill questionnaire first to collect my quantitative data, and what's the exact steps I should follow, and what are these steps called? So I think you're just talking about, if you conducted a pilot, what do you do after that? Usually you would conduct the pilot study for a specific purpose. So to inform the second part of your study. So maybe you're, like you said, maybe you are developing an instrument and you conduct an initial pilot study to see on an initial set of items to look at the reliability, and then see if items need to be changed, or if you can drop items and refine them, so that you kind of arrive at a final set of items to use in your questionnaire or your survey instrument when you do your final study. So there's not going to be like one universal answer for what that process entails. If you are conducting a pilot study, you do want to describe that pilot study in your methodology, and you can even have like a pilot study subheading for it to describe exactly what you're going to be doing in the pilot study and what the purpose is going to be. But generally, you would conduct a pilot study with a specific purpose, so that the results of that pilot study inform what you do in your final study or your full study in terms of your data collection. And since we're at the end of our hour here, I'm just going to get to one more question. And so next question is, what are your views on using platforms such as Amazon MTurk? I mean, I think it's okay to use something like MTurk specifically. I know, and this was many years ago, but I actually used MTurk when I was conducting studies when I was in school for my dissertation, so I have used it. I imagine it's changed a lot over the years, so I don't know all the nuances of MTurk now compared to what it was back then. But at least from my experience back then, there are some advantages to using MTurk in that you can kind of assess the quality of your participants, because I think participants can be rated in terms of how well they're completing certain tasks, and you can adjust your settings so that you only invite people who have a very strong history of completing tasks in a high quality way. So in that way, you can ensure that you get participants who are going to, take your survey seriously and, answer the questions honestly. So that may be one advantage to using MTurk, is that you can help ensure data of higher quality in that sense. But also you have to realize, like anything else, if you're specifically using MTurk, then you're still kind of doing this as a non-probability sample, because if you're just using MTurk, then the only people who can participate in your study are people who are signed up to do tasks on MTurk. So that may not be representative of your general population. So people who do studies on MTurk might differ in some ways from people who don't. So that's just another limitation that you have to take into consideration. But in terms of a means of data collection, it's definitely a valid option, along with things like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics in terms of recruiting participants. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and end the session there, since we have reached the end of our hour. But if you do have additional questions or need additional help, again, our contact information is on the screen here. And a copy of the presentation or recording will also be available for everyone who signed up for the webinar today. So you can go back and review the presentation and the slides. And again, if you have more specific questions, we do other presentations. We may repeat this topic in the future, and we also have webinars on other topics that you are welcome to sign up for. And of course, you're also welcome to contact us if you are interested in one-on-one help. So thanks everyone for attending our webinar today. I hope you found it useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.